Raven Harper sat in the back seat of a sleek black car, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. The world outside passed in a blur. Tall iron gates, sprawling estates, the fading glow of streetlights against the deepening night. She barely noticed. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out everything but the cold weight settling in her chest. She had been sold. She had thought the orphanage was the worst place she would ever know. She had thought the day she turned 18 would bring freedom, that she would finally escape a life dictated by others. But she had been wrong. Terribly wrong. The car slowed, crunching over gravel, and came to a stop before an imposing mansion. Towering columns framed the entrance, the architecture grand and severe, as if carved from the very idea of power. Beyond the polished windows, only darkness awaited. The driver opened her door, but Raven hesitated. Stepping out would make this real. "Move," the man ordered, impatience lacing his tone. With a deep breath, she forced herself forward, her legs stiff as she climbed the stone steps. The massive double doors creaked open before she even reached them, and a man stood waiting in the dimly lit foyer. Callum Aldrich. He wasn't what she expected. He was tall, his presence effortlessly commanding. Dressed in a tailored black suit, his posture was relaxed. Yet there was something coiled beneath the surface, like a storm contained within the frame of a man. His gaze, sharp and unreadable, assessed her with a kind of detached curiosity. Raven met his stare, forcing herself not to look away. She had been under the control of cruel people before, but she had survived. She would survive this too. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of Callum's mouth, as if her defiance amused him. He stepped forward, the soft click of his shoes on marble, the only sound in the suffocating silence. "So, you're the one," he murmured, voice smooth but void of warmth. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "I expected someone different." Raven's jaw tightened. "And I expected freedom." Callum let out a quiet laugh, though there was no real humor in it. "Freedom?" he echoed. "That's an illusion, little bird. There's no such thing." She hated how his voice sent a chill down her spine. With a dismissive glance, he turned and gestured toward the hallway behind him. "You belong here now. You'll follow my rules, and in return, you'll be taken care of." His eyes darkened as they met hers again. Disobedience won't be tolerated. A sick feeling curled in Raven's stomach. "If you think I'm just going to accept this, you will." His words were final, cutting through her resistance like a blade. "Because you have no choice." The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. The weight of her situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. No escape, no options. Only this house, this man, and the chains she couldn't see but could already feel tightening around her. For the first time since stepping out of that car, fear truly took root. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A flicker of something buried deep in her mind. A vague sense of familiarity. She had seen Callum Aldrich before. Not in the newspapers, not on television. Somewhere else. But where? And why did the thought alone make her heart race? Callum must have seen something in her expression because his smirk faded, his brows furrowed, his gaze lingering on her face for just a second too long. Then, just as quickly, his mask of indifference returned. "Go to your room," he said, his voice carrying the same authority as before. A maid appeared from the shadows, waiting to escort her. Raven swallowed hard, forcing herself to walk past him without another word. She didn't know what terrified her more, the reality of her captivity, or the feeling that this was only the beginning. Raven sat at the long dining table, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across the polished wood. The opulence of the room should have been mesmerizing. The towering ceilings, the intricate chandeliers, the velvet drapes heavy with wealth. But all she could focus on was the man seated at the opposite end, Callum Aldrich. He had barely spoken since she was escorted to the dining hall. The only sounds were the quiet clinking of silverware and the occasional crackle of the fireplace. The tension sat thick between them, suffocating. Raven forced herself to eat, her appetite dulled by the weight of her circumstances. Her fingers tightened around the fork as she tried to decipher him. He wasn't what she had expected, not in looks, not in demeanor. There was cruelty in his silence, but not the kind that came from pure malice. It was something else, something calculating. He was watching her, though he made a show of appearing uninterested. His fingers traced the rim of his glass absent-mindedly, his gaze flicking to her every so often, as if studying a puzzle he wasn't sure how to solve. Finally, he broke the silence. "Are you always this quiet?" His voice was smooth, but carried an edge of challenge. Raven set down her fork, meeting his gaze. "Are you always this cold?" A ghost of a smirk touched his lips, but it vanished just as quickly. "You assume I should be something else?" "I assume most people have a conscience." He let out a quiet chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "And yet, here you are." She bristled at his words. He was toying with her, testing her boundaries. But there was something else beneath the surface, hesitation. She had caught it earlier, in the way he had looked at her as if she were a memory rather than a stranger. Now, it was buried under indifference, locked away behind the steel of his control. She pushed her plate aside. "If you expect me to be afraid of you, you'll be disappointed." His gaze darkened, the smirk fading entirely. "Fear is inevitable, Raven. Whether you feel it now or later, that's up to you." The room felt colder. Raven clenched her hands into fists beneath the table. She had lost control of her fate, but she refused to let him break her. For now, she would endure. But she would not surrender. The envelope sat on Callum's desk, a stark contrast against the polished mahogany. No return address, no insignia, just his name, printed in sharp black ink. He had received threats before. It came with the territory. But something about this one unsettled him. He picked it up, tore it open, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "You can't protect what you don't understand. She doesn't belong to you." His grip tightened. Whoever had sent this wasn't just threatening him. They knew about Raven. His jaw clenched as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the words, feeling the weight of something bigger moving beneath the surface. Raven had spent the morning familiarizing herself with the layout of the mansion. She wasn't naive enough to think she could escape. Not yet. But understanding the place, its weaknesses, its blind spots, was her only chance of control. The house was massive, an intricate maze of corridors and rooms filled with quiet luxury. She noted the locked doors, the security cameras, the way the staff moved with well-practiced silence. When she reached the back of the estate, she found a greenhouse, large, elegant, with vines creeping up the glass walls. Inside, the air was humid, filled with the scent of earth and blooming flowers. It felt out of place in a home that was otherwise so cold. Not many people come here. Raven turned sharply, finding herself face to face with an older woman dressed in a crisp, black uniform. The woman studied her, her gray eyes sharp with quiet wisdom. "You must be Meredith," Raven said cautiously. A small smile touched the woman's lips. "And you must be the reason he's more irritable than usual." Raven frowned. "He was already like that before I got here." Meredith chuckled. "Perhaps. But there are things in this house that run deeper than what you see, child." Raven hesitated before asking, "What do you mean?" The woman's expression turned unreadable. "Callum Aldridge is not as impenetrable as he wants the world to believe. But neither are you." Before Raven could respond, Meredith turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the quiet greenhouse, her mind swirling with more questions than answers. Somewhere in this house, the past was waiting, and it was watching them both. Raven stood in the middle of Callum's study, her arms crossed as she glared at him. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the room, deepening the divide between them. He leaned against his desk, watching her with an air of cool indifference, but there was something in his stance, something coiled and dangerous, waiting. "You're playing a game you can't win," Callum said, voice calm but edged with warning. Raven lifted her chin. "I don't play games." A smirk tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, but you do. You think testing me is the same as having power." He tilted his head slightly. "But tell me, what exactly do you think you'll gain from this defiance?" "Maybe I just enjoy getting under your skin," she shot back. Something flickered in his expression, just for a second. A crack in the ice, but then it was gone. He pushed off the desk and closed the space between them in slow, deliberate steps. Raven refused to back away, even when he stopped just a breath away. "You talk about freedom as if you understand it," he murmured. "As if running will give it to you." The air between them tightened. "I know one thing," Raven said, her voice steady. "I'd rather take my chances out there than be caged in here." Callum's expression darkened instantly. His hand twitched at his side, as if resisting the urge to grab her, to shake sense into her. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled, slow and controlled, before stepping back. "You think the outside world will be kind to you?" His voice was quieter now, but laced with something raw, almost bitter. "You have no idea what waits beyond these walls." Raven frowned. There was something in the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about her, but about himself. "I'm not afraid," she said. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's because you don't know enough to be." A heavy silence settled between them. Then, without another word, Callum turned and walked toward the door, his movements as precise as ever. Just before he exited, he spoke over his shoulder. "You won't last a day out there, Raven." His voice was quieter now, almost resigned. "And I won't be the one cleaning up the mess when you realize it." The door closed behind him, leaving her standing in the thick silence of his absence, her heart pounding in her chest. Raven paced the length of her room, her mind spinning. She had overheard it, Callum speaking in hushed tones over the phone, asking for information about her past. Every detail, every trace of where she had come from. Why? The idea unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Callum had made it clear that she was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. So why was he digging into her life? Before she could dwell on it further, a sharp noise split through the air. A rapid series of cracks, loud and unmistakable. Gunfire. Her pulse lurched. The next second, the lights in the mansion flickered. Distant shouts echoed from below, followed by the crash of shattering glass. A surge of adrenaline propelled her to the door, but before she could take a step, it burst open. Callum stood there, his expression grim, a gun gripped in his hand. "Stay down," he ordered, scanning the room before pulling her away from the doorway. His movements were precise, controlled, but his eyes, for the first time, weren't. There was something in them she hadn't seen before. Fear. Not for himself. For her. "What's happening?" Raven demanded, her voice tight. "An attack," he said simply, locking the door behind him. His free hand pressed against the small of her back, guiding her quickly toward the far side of the room. "I need you to do exactly what I say." The words sent a chill through her. He was never this direct, never this serious. Not in a way that felt real. A burst of gunfire rang out again, closer this time. Callum exhaled sharply, gripping her wrist. "Move." He led her through a hidden panel in the bookshelf, into a narrow passageway. The air was damp, the space just wide enough for them to move in single file. Raven's breath came fast, but she kept up. "Who's attacking you?" Callum didn't answer immediately. Then, finally, he muttered, "People who think I have something they want." They emerged into another wing of the mansion, the halls eerily silent. Callum glanced at her, as if debating something. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he said, "You weren't supposed to be in the middle of this." Something in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. For the first time since arriving, Raven realized the truth. Whatever Callum was involved in, whatever ghosts haunted him, she was now part of it too. The mansion had finally fallen silent, but the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. The attack had been swift, calculated. Whoever had come for Callum had meant to send a message. Now, in the dim glow of the firelight, Raven sat beside him on the leather couch in his study, pressing a damp cloth against a cut just above his eyebrow. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up, revealing scratches and bruises along his forearm. He barely flinched at her touch, his expression unreadable. "You should let someone else do this," Raven muttered, dabbing at the wound carefully. "I don't trust someone else." His voice was quiet, yet firm. She hesitated before responding. "And you trust me?" A smirk tugged at his lips, but there was no real humor in it. "Not entirely." Raven rolled her eyes but said nothing, focusing instead on the slow, deliberate movements of her hands. The warmth of his skin under her fingertips sent an odd shiver up her spine. She pushed the feeling aside. For a long moment, there was only silence, the crackling of the fire filling the room. Then Callum exhaled, his voice softer than before. "You remind me of someone." Raven stilled. The words hung between them, heavy with something unspoken. She glanced up at him, but his gaze was distant, as if he were looking at someone else entirely. There was something almost vulnerable in his expression, something she wasn't sure she had ever seen before. She swallowed. "Who?" Callum blinked, as if shaking himself from a trance. His jaw tensed, and he turned his head slightly, as if the answer was just out of reach. "I don't know," he admitted, almost to himself, "but it feels like I should." Something flickered in Raven's mind, a fleeting sensation, like the edges of a dream she couldn't quite grasp. It was gone before she could catch it, leaving behind only a vague unease. She pulled her hand back, studying him. Callum was always composed, always in control. But now, in this moment, he looked conflicted. "You should rest," she murmured, unsure of what else to say. His gaze lingered on her for a second longer than necessary before he leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly. Raven turned away, but her own thoughts refused to quiet. Somewhere, buried deep in forgotten memories, a connection was waiting to be found. The tension between them had changed. Raven could feel it in the way Callum looked at her, sharp, assessing, but no longer indifferent. It was as if she had become a puzzle he was desperate to solve, yet reluctant to finish. She wasn't sure when it had started. Maybe after the attack. Maybe after that moment in the firelight, when his guard had slipped just enough to let her see something real beneath the steel. Whatever it was, it unsettled her. She was supposed to hate him. Yet, when she caught him watching her from across the room, his gaze dark and unreadable, it wasn't fear that tightened her chest. It was something far more dangerous. Tonight was no different. They stood in the dim hallway outside the study, the silence between them thick with everything unsaid. Raven crossed her arms, tilting her chin defiantly. "If you have something to say, just say it." Callum leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, his expression unreadable. "You think I owe you explanations?" "I think you don't know what to do with me," she shot back. Something flickered in his eyes, a momentary shift, but then his mask returned. He pushed off the wall and took a slow step toward her. "What I do with you isn't your concern." Raven refused to back away. She had spent too long feeling powerless. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Then why do you keep looking at me like that?" His expression tightened. "Like what?" "Like you're trying to figure out something you already know," she said, voice quieter now. Callum's jaw clenched. For a second, just a second, something unreadable passed through his gaze. Something raw. He was too close now. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the tension humming in the air between them like a wire stretched too thin. Then, before she could react, his hand lifted, fingertips brushing just barely against the side of her face, as if testing the sensation. Raven's breath hitched. Time slowed. He was going to kiss her. She could see it in the way his gaze dropped to her lips, feel it in the hesitation of his touch. But then, just as suddenly, he pulled back, a sharp inhale breaking the moment. His expression darkened, his hand falling away as if burned. "This can't happen," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Raven blinked, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Then why did you?" "Go to bed," he interrupted, his voice rough, strained. And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, heart racing, her world suddenly more complicated than ever. The grand ballroom of the St. Augustine Hotel shimmered under golden chandeliers, the hum of polite conversation and clinking glasses filling the air. Raven felt the weight of countless gazes on her, whispers brushing against her like a cold wind. She didn't belong here. Yet here she was, standing beside Callum Aldridge, her arm resting in the crook of his as they navigated the sea of wealth and power. He had barely spoken to her since they arrived, his grip firm but impersonal. To the outside world, she was nothing more than a guest under his protection. To those who truly understood Callum's world, she was something far more complicated. She caught glimpses of curiosity in the eyes of the guests, silent questions lingering beneath well-mannered smiles. "Let them talk," Callum murmured beside her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Raven tilted her head slightly, keeping her expression neutral. "They're not the only ones wondering why I'm here." Callum's lips barely twitched at her challenge. "You're here because I said so." She turned to face him fully, unamused. "That's not an answer." Before he could reply, the orchestra began playing a slow, haunting waltz. A waiter passed by, and Callum took 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to her. She hesitated before accepting it, letting the flute rest between her fingers. Then, with a smoothness that should have alarmed her, Callum placed his glass down and extended a hand. "Dance with me." It wasn't a request. Raven hesitated. "I don't." "You do now." Something about the certainty in his voice sent a shiver through her. Reluctantly, she placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. The moment his hand settled on her waist, a charge passed between them. Something unsaid, unacknowledged, but undeniably there. Callum moved with precision, his grip firm but controlled. He led her effortlessly, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The rest of the room blurred, voices fading into the background. For the first time since she had been thrown into his world, she felt something shift between them. "You're not as unaffected as you pretend to be," she murmured, her breath barely grazing his cheek. His grip tightened just slightly. "Neither are you." Raven looked up at him then, searching his face. For once, his walls weren't entirely in place. There was something raw in his expression, something she wasn't sure he even realized he was revealing. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Callum exhaled slowly, pulling back just enough to create distance, but not enough to break their hold. "This can't happen," he said, echoing the words he had spoken before. Raven's heart pounded. "Why not?" His jaw tightened, his fingers lingering on her waist a second too long before finally, reluctantly, letting go. "Because if it does," he said quietly, "I won't be able to stop." And with that, he stepped away, leaving her breathless in the middle of the dance floor, the ghost of his touch burning against her skin. Raven had been paying attention. Since the night of the charity event, something had shifted, not just between her and Callum, but around him. The glances he exchanged with certain guests, the coded conversations, the way his grip had tightened slightly on her waist during their dance, as if sensing a threat lurking in the air. Now, days later, she was beginning to see the full picture. Callum Aldridge wasn't just a powerful man. He was a man surrounded by vultures, each waiting for the right moment to strike. And somehow, she had become part of their game. She stood at the edge of the study, watching as Callum paced near the windows, his phone pressed to his ear. His face was sharp with irritation, his voice low but firm. "No. If they think they can use her, they're mistaken," he said before ending the call abruptly. Raven's arms crossed over her chest. "Who was that?" Callum didn't turn immediately. "It doesn't concern you." She let out a dry laugh. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like I'm right in the middle of it." At that, he finally faced her. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his stance. "You are," he admitted. "And that's exactly why I need you to stay out of it." Raven took a step forward. "Out of what, Callum? What is this really about? Who are you fighting?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't a fight. It's survival. And right now, you're leveraged to the wrong people." Raven swallowed hard. She had suspected as much, but hearing him say it made the danger feel even more real. "So what?" she challenged. "You're just going to keep me locked away like some kind of hostage?" His eyes darkened. "I'm keeping you alive." The weight of his words settled between them. Raven clenched her fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. "And what about what I want?" He took a slow step toward her. "This isn't about what you want." The room suddenly felt too small, the air charged with something unspoken. "Then what is it about?" she pressed. For a long moment, he didn't answer. He just looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to convince himself of something. Then, without warning, he moved. 1 second, there was space between them. The next, his hands were on her face, his lips crashing against hers in an impulsive, desperate kiss. Raven froze, the shock of it stealing her breath. His grip was firm but hesitant, as if he had lost control for the first time and was realizing it too late. But just as quickly as it happened, it was over. Callum pulled away abruptly, his breathing uneven, his hands still lingering at her jaw before he clenched them into fists and stepped back. His expression was a storm. Anger, regret, something deeper he refused to name. He shook his head. This was a mistake. Raven's pulse pounded. Then why did you do it? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, lips tingling, heart racing, knowing that whatever had just happened between them was far from over. Raven felt the shift the moment Callum re-entered the room. His presence was different, tighter, tenser. He had always carried an air of controlled power, but now, something darker lurked beneath his surface. It wasn't just his usual guarded demeanor. It was personal. She was about to ask what was wrong when he spoke first. Sit. A command, not a request. Raven folded her arms. I don't take orders from you. Callum's jaw tightened. He wasn't in the mood for games. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate strides. You're not leaving my sight, he said flatly. The certainty in his voice sent a chill through her. Raven frowned. Excuse me? I don't trust you on your own. His tone was controlled, but his fingers curled into his palms as if suppressing something volatile. Not after what I just learned. Raven's heartbeat kicked up. Which is? Callum studied her for a long moment before exhaling, as if weighing whether to tell her the truth. Someone from your past, he said finally. Someone I thought was my enemy is connected to you? The words settled over her like a heavy fog. She shook her head. That's impossible. I don't have anyone. His voice hardened. Then explain why your name came up in a meeting with people who want me dead. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had spent most of her life alone, scraping by, forgotten. The idea that her past was tangled in Callum's world made no sense. I don't know, she admitted. But if you think I have anything to do with this, I don't. His voice softened just slightly. But someone else does. And that makes you a target. Raven swallowed hard. So what does that mean for me? Callum's expression darkened. It means from now on, you don't go anywhere without me. The finality in his words sent frustration curling through her. I'm not a prisoner, Callum. His eyes locked onto hers. A prisoner has no choice. You do. Raven inhaled sharply, but before she could respond, he turned away, pacing. You don't get it, do you? He muttered. You think I'm doing this to control you? She clenched her fists. Aren't you? He stopped abruptly and faced her. If something happens to you because of me, I won't be able to live with it. The confession knocked the air from her lungs. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She should have been angry, should have pushed back harder, should have hated the way he made decisions for her. But instead, she felt something else, something far more dangerous. Something that made her realize she wasn't just being pulled into Callum's world. She was already in it. The memory came in flashes, shadows stretching across damp concrete, the scent of rust and rain in the air. A boy, barely older than she had been, slumped against the wall of a dark alley, his shirt soaked with blood. She had been just a child, wandering the streets alone, searching for scraps of food or a warm place to sleep. But when she saw him, when their eyes met, filled with the same fear, the same desperation, something in her had refused to walk away. She had knelt beside him, pressing a torn piece of fabric against his wound, whispering reassurances she had barely believed herself. She had stayed with him until the sound of approaching voices forced her to run. And then, the memory had disappeared, buried under years of survival. Until now, Raven shot up from the chair in her room, her breath uneven. Callum. The boy in the alley had been Callum. She barely registered her own movements as she stormed down the hallway, her pulse hammering. The pieces fit too perfectly, the haunted look in his eyes when he had said she reminded him of someone, the way he always seemed to hesitate before pushing her away. She found him in the study, standing near the fireplace, his back to her. I remember, she blurted out. Callum stiffened but didn't turn. Raven took a step closer, her voice steadier this time. I remember you. Slowly, he turned to face her, his expression carefully guarded. What are you talking about? She swallowed hard. Years ago. The alley. You were hurt. She exhaled sharply. I saved you. Callum's jaw tensed, but he didn't speak. You knew, didn't you? She accused, stepping forward. That's why you looked at me like that when we met. That's why you. I didn't know, he cut in, his voice low, but there was something raw beneath it. Not for sure. Raven studied him, realization sinking in. But you suspected. Callum turned away, running a hand down his face. It didn't make sense. The memory was hazy, and I wasn't the same person then. Neither of them had been. Raven's heart pounded. All this time, I thought you were just some cruel, untouchable man. But I knew you before all of this. Before you became who you are now. Callum exhaled slowly, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were unreadable, but for the first time, she saw something beneath the steel, something vulnerable. This doesn't change anything, he murmured. Raven's throat tightened. Doesn't it? Callum took a slow step toward her, and for a moment, it felt like everything around them had disappeared. Then, just as quickly, he turned away. If anything, it only makes things more complicated. Raven clenched her fists. You don't get to decide that. A bitter smile ghosted his lips. Don't I? She wanted to argue, wanted to force him to acknowledge what this meant. But Callum Aldridge was a man who had spent years burying his past. And now, he was trying to bury her with it. The fire in the study had burned low, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Callum stood near the window, his back to her, his posture rigid. Raven had followed him after their confrontation, refusing to let him retreat into himself again. Not this time. Not after everything. You can't just walk away from this, she said quietly. Callum let out a slow breath, still refusing to face her. I'm not walking away. I'm keeping you out of something you don't understand. Raven stepped closer. Then help me understand. He finally turned, his eyes dark with something unreadable. You think knowing changes things? That just because you were there that night, just because you helped a boy bleeding out in an alley, it means we're connected? Raven flinched but didn't back down. I know it means something to you, even if you won't admit it. Callum laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're naive if you think that night shaped me into something worth saving. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then, for the first time, Callum's mask cracked. I wasn't supposed to survive, he said, voice rough. The people who hurt me that night, who left me to die, they weren't strangers. They were people I trusted. People who were supposed to protect me. Raven's breath caught. Callum's gaze dropped to the floor. I learned that night that loyalty is a lie. That survival is the only thing that matters. And the only way to survive is to never let anyone get close enough to be a weakness. Raven swallowed, stepping even closer. Is that what I am to you? A weakness? His eyes met hers, something raw flickering in them. You're the first person in years who's made me wonder if I've been wrong. The confession hung between them, fragile and real. Raven hesitated for only a second before reaching out, her fingers brushing his forearm. He stiffened at first but didn't pull away. You don't have to do this alone, Callum, she said softly. Whatever you've built to keep people out, it doesn't have to keep you locked in. He let out a slow, shaky breath, as if her words had unsettled something inside him. For the first time since she had met him, he looked tired. Not in the way exhaustion settled into the body, but in the way it settled into the soul. And for once, he didn't push her away. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows in relentless sheets. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the walls of the mansion. The power had gone out nearly an hour ago, plunging the house into shadows. Raven sat on the couch in the dim glow of the fireplace, her fingers curled around the edge of a blanket draped over her lap. Callum stood across the room, near the window, staring into the darkness outside as if lost in thought. The firelight flickered over the sharp planes of his face, casting him in a glow that made him look both untouchable and unbearably human. She had never seen him this unguarded. "You don't like storms, do you?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Callum's shoulders tensed slightly before he turned to face her. "I don't like things I can't control." Raven let out a breathless laugh. "That explains a lot." His lips twitched as if he might smile, but then he just shook his head and walked toward her. He stopped a few steps away, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. The space between them felt charged, as if the storm outside had found its way into the room. "You should sleep," he said, but there was something unconvincing in his voice. Raven met his gaze, holding it. "You should stop pretending you don't feel this." The air shifted. Callum's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Raven." Her name was a warning, but it came out almost desperate. She stood, slowly closing the last bit of space between them. She wasn't sure where this boldness was coming from, only that the pull between them was undeniable. "You think pushing me away will make it stop?" she whispered. His breath was uneven. She could see it in the way his chest rose and fell, in the way his fingers twitched, as if fighting the urge to reach for her. Then, finally, he snapped. With a low curse, he closed the distance between them in a single step, his hands gripping her face as his lips crashed against hers. The kiss was raw, desperate, years of restraint unraveling in an instant. His fingers tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, as if he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. Raven melted into him, her hands pressing against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. But just as suddenly as it began, he pulled away. His forehead rested against hers, his breath ragged. "I can't," he murmured, his hands still on her, as if he couldn't bring himself to let go completely. Raven searched his face. "You're afraid," she realized. Callum's grip on her tightened for a fraction of a second before he stepped back, his eyes stormy. "Afraid of what happens if I don't stop." Raven's heart pounded. He was falling, and despite everything, despite the danger and the chaos surrounding them, she was falling too. The morning after the storm, the air in the mansion felt different. Colder, heavier. Raven sensed it the moment she woke. The warmth of last night, of Callum's kiss, of the way his hands had held her like she was something precious, was gone. She found him in his study, his back to her, staring out the window. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her stomach. Callum turned slowly, his expression unreadable. His usual composure was back in place, but something was off. His eyes, which had burned with something raw the night before, were now empty. "There's nothing to talk about," he said flatly. Raven's brow furrowed. "Last night was a mistake." The words cut like a blade. She flinched but refused to look away. "You don't mean that." His jaw tightened. "You think this is a game, Raven? That what happened last night changed anything?" He let out a humorless laugh, stepping closer. "You're naive if you believe that." Anger flared in her chest. "I'm not naive. I know what I felt, and I know you felt it too." His expression darkened. "It doesn't matter what I felt." Raven took a step forward, desperate now. "Why are you doing this?" Callum hesitated, just for a second, but then his mask hardened. "Because you don't belong here." His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like ice. "I should never have let you think you did." Raven's breath caught in her throat. She searched his face, looking for any sign of the man from last night. The one who had kissed her like he was drowning, like she was the only thing keeping him afloat. But that man was gone. "Leave," he said, voice quieter now. Raven's heart pounded. "What if I don't?" Callum exhaled sharply and looked away. "Then I'll make you." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Raven clenched her fists. Every instinct in her screamed that this wasn't real, that this was Callum protecting himself, protecting her. But he had made his choice, and now she had to make hers. With a slow nod, she turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't stop. Not when she reached the door, not when she stepped out into the cold morning air. And she didn't look back, because if she did, she might have seen Callum standing in the doorway, watching her go. his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. And she might have realized he was breaking too. The city felt different now. Raven had spent years surviving on her own, yet after leaving Callum, the streets of New Orleans felt unfamiliar, like she no longer belonged to them. She had tried to convince herself that walking away had been her choice, that she wasn't still haunted by the feel of his hands on her skin, the way his voice had broken when he told her to leave. But no matter how much she tried to silence the ache, it lingered. She had rented a small apartment in a part of town where no one asked questions. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She spent her days trying to build a routine, trying to forget the man who had thrown her away. It was late when she noticed the shift, the feeling of being watched, the uneasy prickle at the back of her neck. At first, she told herself she was being paranoid, that after everything, it was just her mind playing tricks on her, until she stepped into the alley behind her building, and the world tilted. A cloth pressed over her mouth. The sharp scent of something chemical filled her lungs. Hands gripped her arms as she thrashed, but the fight drained from her limbs too fast. Darkness closed in. She never even saw their faces. When Raven woke, the air was damp, stale. Her head pounded, her wrists aching from the rope that bound them behind her back. Cold stone pressed against her cheek as she struggled to focus. A warehouse. Dim lighting. Shadows shifting beyond her line of sight. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. "You put up more of a fight than I expected," a voice mused. Raven forced her head up, blinking against the harsh overhead light. A man stood before her, tall and dressed in a dark suit, his expression a perfect blend of amusement and calculation. "Who the hell are you?" she rasped. The man crouched, leveling his gaze with hers. "Someone Callum Aldridge took something from." He tilted his head. "And now, I intend to return the favor." Her stomach twisted. This wasn't random. This was for Callum. Raven's pulse pounded. "He won't come for me," she lied, her voice steadier than she felt. The man smiled. "Oh, I think we both know that's not true." He stood and nodded to someone behind her. A phone was pressed to her ear before she could react. A familiar voice answered on the other end. "Callum Aldridge." Raven's throat tightened. The man leaned closer, his breath warm against her temple. "Scream for him, darling." Raven closed her eyes. And then, she did. Callum had always known how the game was played. Power, leverage, control. He had spent his entire life mastering them, anticipating moves before they happened, striking first so no one could strike him. But this time, he had lost the upper hand. The moment he heard Raven scream through the phone, something inside him snapped. He had forced her away to protect her, lied to her, hurt her, told himself it was the only way to keep her safe. And now, she was in the hands of his enemies because of it. A voice filled the line, smooth and calculated. "Come alone, Callum. No guards, no weapons, or she dies." The line went dead. Callum stood frozen, the phone still clutched in his hand, his pulse a slow, steady drum of fury. His enemies thought this was leverage, that they had backed him into a corner. They had no idea what he would do for her. The warehouse was nearly silent when Callum stepped inside. Dim overhead lights flickered against rusted beams. The scent of oil and damp concrete filled the air. And there, in the center of the room, bound to a chair, was Raven. Her wrists were raw from the rope, her face pale, but she was breathing, alive. A single glance at her was enough. The fire in his chest turned to ice. "I'm here," he said, his voice calm. "Let her go." A man stepped forward, the same one from the call. His smile was sharp, predatory. "You made this easy, Aldridge." Callum ignored him. His eyes were on Raven, scanning her for injuries, silently willing her to understand. She shook her head, her expression wild with desperation. "No," she whispered. "Don't do this." But he already had. He lifted his hands, allowing the guards to strip him of his weapons, of any illusion that he had a way out. And for the first time in his life, Callum Aldridge surrendered. Not to his enemies, to her. The tension in the warehouse was suffocating. The guards had stripped Callum of everything, his weapons, his defenses, but not his resolve. Raven's breathing was shallow, her wrists still bound, but her eyes never left his. She was terrified, not for herself, for him. The man in charge, Vincent Carter, one of Callum's oldest enemies, smirked. I expected more of a fight, Aldrich. Maybe you've gone soft. Callum tilted his head slightly, his expression eerily calm. You think I came here unprepared? Vincent chuckled. You came alone. You're finished. Callum's lips barely curved. Am I? A beat of silence. Then, the lights cut out. A sharp crack split through the air, followed by the chaos of gunfire. In the darkness, Callum moved. He had counted the guards, memorized their positions the moment he entered. The second the room plunged into shadows, he struck. A struggle, the scent of blood, the sharp ring of a gunshot too close. Then, Raven's gasp. Callum's body jolted as pain tore through his side. His vision blurred for a split second, but he forced himself to stay upright. He had one job, one purpose. Get to her. The emergency lights flickered back on just in time for Vincent to see his mistake. Callum was still standing, breathing heavily, bleeding, but standing. And his hands were no longer empty. He had a gun, a stolen one, taken in the chaos, now pressed against Vincent's temple. Callum's voice was a rasp of steel. Let her go. Vincent hesitated. Callum cocked the gun. Now. The guards hesitated, then dropped their weapons. Someone cut Raven loose, and she stumbled forward, catching herself against Callum's chest. His arm wrapped around her instinctively, steadying her even as his own body threatened to give out. Vincent gritted his teeth. You won't make it out alive. Callum exhaled slowly, ignoring the searing pain in his side. Watch me. Then, without another word, he pulled the trigger. Not to kill, just enough to make sure no one ever tried taking her from him again. And with that, he turned, pulling Raven with him, and together, they walked out into the night. The ride back to the mansion was a blur. Raven barely remembered how they got there, only that Callum was bleeding, too much, too fast. By the time she helped him into his room, his breathing was labored, his skin pale. She pressed him down onto the bed, her hands shaking as she grabbed the medical supplies from the drawer. You need a doctor, she said, voice tight with panic. Callum gave a weak smirk. I've survived worse. Raven's eyes burned. That's not the point. She worked quickly, pressing gauze against the wound at his side, applying pressure even as he sucked in a sharp breath. He was trying to stay in control, trying to mask the pain, but she saw through it. She had always seen through him. Why did you do that? She asked, her voice quieter now. Why did you trade yourself for me? Callum exhaled slowly, eyes closing for a moment before he finally spoke. Because there was no other option. She swallowed. You could have died. His gaze lifted to hers, something raw flickering in his eyes. So could you. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Then, softer this time, Callum added, I thought pushing you away would protect you. That if I kept you at a distance, I could keep you safe. His fingers twitched slightly at his side, as if he wanted to reach for her but didn't know how. But I was wrong. Raven stilled. Callum had spent his entire life keeping people out, never admitting weakness, never letting himself need anyone. But now, here he was, broken and bleeding, telling her the one thing she never thought he'd say. His voice was rough when he spoke again. I love you. Raven's breath hitched. She had suspected it, felt it in the way he looked at her, in the way he had kissed her, in the way he had thrown himself into danger for her without hesitation. But hearing it was different. Hearing it made something inside her crack wide open. She didn't speak, just reached forward, her hand pressing against the side of his face, her thumb brushing along his jaw. I'm not leaving, she whispered. Callum exhaled shakily, his fingers finally lifting to curl around hers. Good, he murmured, his eyes locked onto hers. Because I don't think I could survive it if you did. And this time, he didn't push her away. The waves crashed gently against the shore, the golden sand warm beneath Raven's bare feet. The salty breeze tangled in her hair as she stood at the edge of the water, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. Behind her, the small villa stood nestled between palm trees, its white walls glowing under the fading light. A world away from the cold, towering mansion Callum had once ruled from. A world away from the violence, the danger, the past they had both barely survived. She still couldn't believe it was real. A deep voice broke the silence behind her. Second thoughts? She turned to see Callum standing in the doorway, barefoot, sleeves rolled up, looking more at ease than she had ever seen him. He was still healing, the wound on his side forcing him to move slower, but the weight on his shoulders, the one he had carried for years, seemed lighter. Raven shook her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. No, just adjusting. Callum stepped closer, his hand finding hers with a quiet certainty. It doesn't feel real yet. She nodded. We've spent so long fighting. It's strange not having to look over our shoulders. He exhaled, glancing out at the ocean. I spent years building a life where I controlled everything. Power meant safety. And for a long time, I thought that was the only way to survive. His fingers tightened around hers. But none of it mattered without you. Raven swallowed the lump in her throat. She had always seen the man behind the walls, the one he tried to bury beneath steel and control. And now, here he was, stripped of everything except what truly mattered. Him, her, them. What happens now? She asked softly. Callum turned to face her fully, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Now we live. No more games. No more enemies. Just them. In a place where no one could take this from them. Raven smiled, leaning into his touch. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running. For the first time, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The night air was warm, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine as Raven walked along the edge of the villa's terrace. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, moonlight reflecting off the gentle waves. Everything about this place, the stillness, the quiet freedom, felt surreal. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running. She wasn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next fight, the next betrayal, the next reason to leave. She was home. Footsteps sounded behind her, familiar and steady. Callum. She turned as he approached, hands in his pockets, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. He had always been beautiful in a way that was sharp and untouchable, but now, in the glow of lantern light, there was something different about him, something peaceful. You're thinking too much, he murmured, stopping beside her. Raven smirked. I do that a lot. He exhaled a quiet chuckle. I know. He glanced at her, a small flicker of hesitation in his eyes. But are you happy? The question made her chest tighten. Happiness had always felt like a fleeting thing, something she could touch but never truly hold. But here now, with him, yes, she whispered, because for the first time, she meant it. Something in Callum's expression shifted, and before she could process it, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Raven's breath caught. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at her, his gaze unwavering. I spent my whole life believing love was a weakness, that needing someone meant losing control. Raven swallowed hard, unable to speak. Callum exhaled slowly. Then you happened. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing control. I was afraid of losing you. Her heart pounded as he flipped the box open, revealing a ring. Simple, elegant, but undeniably perfect. I don't want to just be free with you, Raven, he said, voice low, steady. I want to build something with you. A life. A future. He took a slow breath. Marry me. Tears burned behind her eyes. She had never imagined this. Never thought someone like her, who had spent years surviving, would find someone who wanted to build a life with her. But Callum wasn't just someone. He was hers. A slow smile spread across her lips, her chest tightening as she whispered, yes. And just like that, she was no longer bound by the past. She was free. The sun hung low over the horizon, bathing the world in hues of gold and amber. The ocean stretched endlessly behind them, waves lapping gently against the shore. Soft petals from wildflowers danced in the warm breeze, carried through the open-air ceremony. Raven stood barefoot on the sand, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She had spent years surviving, always looking for an escape, always preparing for the worst. But today, there was no past chasing her, no shadows waiting to pull her back. Today, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Callum stood at the end of the aisle, waiting for her. Dressed in a crisp white linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up, he looked different from the man she had met in that cold, unforgiving mansion. The weight of his past had lifted from his shoulders, replaced with something lighter, something real. She took a slow breath and stepped forward. Every moment that had led them here flashed through her mind. His icy indifference when they first met, the stolen glances, the tension that had simmered between them for so long. The way he had pushed her away to protect her, the way he had nearly died to save her. And now, he was giving her forever. When she reached him, Callum took her hands in his grip warm and steady. The officiant began speaking, but Raven barely heard. All she could focus on was him. His deep, steady breath, the way his thumb traced slow circles against her palm, the rare softness in his gaze. Then it was time for their vows. Callum went first. "I used to believe love was a weakness," he admitted, his voice steady but rough with emotion. "That if I let someone in, I'd lose myself. That needing someone would make me vulnerable." He swallowed, his fingers tightening around hers. "Then I met you." Raven felt her throat tighten. "You weren't supposed to change me," Callum continued, a small, almost amused flicker in his eyes. "You weren't supposed to matter, but you did. You always did." He took a breath, exhaling slowly. "I love you, Raven, and I promise that no matter what comes, no matter where we go, you will never have to face the world alone again." A tear slipped down her cheek. She squeezed his hands before speaking. "For so long, I didn't think I belonged anywhere. I thought I was meant to be alone, to keep moving, to never get attached." She let out a shaky breath. "Then you ruined that." Callum let out a quiet chuckle, his thumb brushing away her tear. "You terrified me," she admitted, her voice softer now. "Not because of what you were, but because of what you made me feel." She swallowed hard. "But I'm not afraid anymore. Because you showed me that love isn't a chain. It's freedom." His breath hitched just slightly. Raven took one final, steady breath. "And I choose you, Callum, today and every day after." A hush fell over the small gathering as the officiant spoke the final words. "You may now kiss your bride." Callum didn't hesitate. He pulled her close, his lips capturing hers in a slow, deep kiss. One that spoke of promises kept, of battles won, of a love that had survived everything meant to destroy it. The world faded, leaving only the two of them. Finally, after everything, they were free. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that only came when the world had finally settled. A warm breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of salt and flowers, rustling the sheer white curtains. Moonlight spilled across the bed, casting a soft glow over Raven's sleeping form. Callum lay beside her, his head propped on one arm, watching her breathe. She looked peaceful, her dark lashes resting against her cheeks, her lips slightly parted. Her hair was tousled against the pillows, strands catching in the silver light. For so long, he had been afraid of moments like this. Moments where his walls were down, where he wasn't in control, where someone else had the power to unravel him. And Raven had unraveled him completely. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. She shifted slightly, murmuring something incoherent before nestling closer, her fingers instinctively seeking his beneath the sheets. Callum exhaled slowly, feeling the steady warmth of her body against his. He had spent a lifetime building a world where nothing could touch him, where emotions were weaknesses, attachments were liabilities, and love was nothing more than a weapon used to destroy. And yet, here he was, staring at the one thing he had never wanted to lose. His entire life had been about control, controlling his empire, controlling the threats around him, controlling himself. But no amount of control had stopped her from walking into his life, from shaking the very foundation of everything he thought he knew. He had tried to fight it, tried to push her away, tried to convince himself that he didn't need her. But in the end, the truth had been undeniable. She was never his weakness. She was his salvation. Callum's gaze softened as he traced his fingers lightly over her hand, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger. the promise they had made to each other, the future they had chosen. A quiet hum of contentment escaped her lips as she shifted again, her head resting against his chest now, her breath warm against his skin. For the first time in years, he felt light, not weighed down by the past, not consumed by the battles he had fought. Just here, just hers. He pressed a lingering kiss against the top of her head, letting himself close his eyes for a moment, savoring the simple, perfect peace of having her beside him. Then, barely above a whisper, he murmured, "I spent my whole life trying to control the world, but you were the only thing I never wanted to lose." Raven stirred slightly, her hand tightening around his. Even in sleep, she held on to him. And Callum Aldridge, the man who had once believed he could never belong to anyone, finally understood what it meant to be free.